Hello and welcome to the episode 3 of the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast. I'm Tom Luongo. It is Friday, May 5th, 2017. So, what a day yesterday. Big day. Got a lot to talk about. Let's get to it. Got a lot of questions after yesterday's big day. We had, but the big thing to talk about right now, the first thing I want to talk about is what is being dubbed Macron Gate. So French presidential candidate Emmanuel Macron. It's been uncovered through some research via the guys on 4chan at /Paul that he's got an offshore bank account. And it's funny, I was watching Jack Posovic's Periscope on this last night and some other stuff, and it's pretty obvious that, as he put it, that the French people care more about the fact that he's got an offshore bank account than they do about wanting to continue to let Muslims in and destabilize the country. It makes little sense, but it is what it is. And given the French's long-standing dalliance, or more than dalliance, really, relationship with socialism, the idea of not paying your fair share in taxes it makes sense that would be a divisive issue. So we want to watch to see if this actually is able to close the gap in the final days between now and tomorrow when people go to the polls, because apparently this was the biggest story in France yesterday. So if this has even more traction and more legs coming into the election tomorrow morning, it could change everything. And even then, even if he still winds up winning, the possibility of him being able to coalesce the people around him and be able to have command and control of the government is still really, really thin. And I point out to you as well that Martin Armstrong's timing models have been targeting this week as a big shocker to the markets, and we're not sure what that means. We just know that there's going to be volatility this week coming up, or at least according to Martin's models, there could be. When large things like this happen, or with the potential for huge events like this, Martin's models usually get them right. So we want to watch that carefully, because what this could do is, if Macron wins on tomorrow, right, or on Sunday, then then most likely you'll see the euro continue to rally from where it is, and it's pushing up towards $1.10 now because of the quote-unquote odds of him winning. The question is whether or not the polls are accurately able to capture and describe what the voters, what's going through that whole undecided voters, that whole segment of voters who are undecided, what's going through their minds right now, and we don't know. And the polls have not been able to accurately capture that, I don't think. I remind you that Francois Mélenchon, the communist or far leftist, for lack of a better term, he rose in the polls to 19% from under 5% in 2 weeks before the first round election, simply because he positioned himself farther along the Frexit spectrum than Marine Le Pen did. So there's a built-in 40% or more for Frexit being their primary issue. And if that's the case, then Macron's chances of winning are not nearly as strong as a lot of people think they are. And I wrote about this for Halsey News right after the first round of elections, and I said the exact same thing. And we really haven't gotten very good polling since then. If he had this thing in a lock, Obama would not be out there endorsing him. And the last time Obama endorsed something, endorsed a position in European politics, it was Brexit, and he was on the wrong side of it. So here's hoping that history repeats itself. So this guy is slimy. He is nothing more than Francois Hollande repackaged in a different format, so that, because he used to be a socialist, he broke with the Socialist Party, Hollande's party, early in 2016 in order to mount this quote-unquote outsider challenge, when really it's nothing of the sort. It's simply a warmed-over version of the Socialist Party, and with the veneer of him being an independent. So he might disagree with Hollande on a couple of things, but Hollande is hated in France. The last numbers I saw is that the man has a 4% approval rating. 4, not 40, 4. 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Seriously, 4%. And the idea that Macron is going to be any more popular if he does win the election is ludicrous, because he's not going to be. Because he's going to be exactly the same as Hollande. He's going to do the EU's bidding in every way. Marine Le Pen is right in saying that no matter who wins this election, France will be governed by a woman, either me or Mrs. Merkel in Germany. Unbelievably brilliant quote. And I think that at a certain level, the difference between her and him is striking. Just if you watch the two of them, if you watch any of the debate, you could see it in how genuine she is for all of her faults. And she's much like Donald Trump. She's got her faults. But for all of her faults, she's genuine. She genuinely cares, and she genuinely wants France to be the best society and the best country that it can be. And he wants the best for the French people. And he works for drunks like Jean-Claude Juncker and Angela Merkel, who's not a drunk, but she, yeah, you know what I mean. But she's an awful globalist. So it's all just bad. So let's see what happens here. This is a very, very stark choice that the French people have for the first time in, something like since de Gaulle ran. I mean, it's a long time coming that something like this can finally a choice like this can finally be put in front of the French people for them to decide what they want to be. Do they want to be a vassal state to Germany within a bureaucratic nightmare known as the EU, or do they want to begin the process of charting their own course independent of that going forward and start to divorce themselves from the train wreck that is the EU? So, vive Le Pen. All right, so moving on to the number 2, I want to talk about, this is important, and this podcast may go a little long today, simply because there was so much to talk about from yesterday and the day before. So earlier in the week, I mentioned at the last podcast that there was a phone call between Trump and Putin, and that's a good thing. And unequivocally, when world leaders, especially two incredibly important world leaders like Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, are talking, the world is a safer place. Fundamentally, it's just a safer place if the two of them are talking. If they're not talking, it's a very bad thing. So they're talking, that's great. But what's important is that that phone call happened against the backdrop of a number of other things that were occurring at the same time relative to Putin, not necessarily Trump. Trump's really not that important in this calculus, and I'm going to spin out for you relative to this quote unquote Syrian safe zones that has been proposed and agreed upon by the 3 guarantors of the Astana peace talks process, Russia, Turkey, and Iran. And Turkey is the key player here. So let's spin it out real quick and so you have an idea of the complexity of the situation. And I recommend a very good article by Alexander Mercouris, which I'll have a link to in the description of this video, that you read his initial thoughts on this, because he spins out more or less 5 different potential scenarios. I also wrote an article for Halsey News, which should be live today, discussing the same issues and what I think is actually the most important issue. But getting to it, Putin met with both Turkish President Erdogan and he also met with German Chancellor Merkel this week, as well as the latest rounds of the Astana peace talks were going on in Kazakhstan to try and build a more permanent ceasefire arrangement and a more permanent delineation between who is a terrorist and who is an armed opposition that can be worked with politically. So we need to split basically what the Astana peace talks are doing is trying to split the groups up into the ones that will only accept a military solution and the ones that will accept a political solution. Those that are willing to accept a political solution we have a ceasefire arrangement with them. Now the goal is, and this is what's interesting, now the goal is to create safe zones in the western part of the country where the Syrian army has the most control, to stop the hostilities, allow civilians an opportunity, a place to congregate without having to leave to go to Turkey and emigrate to Turkey and to Europe and the United States and other places. And and deconflict those zones completely. Now, the Americans want the same thing. The neocon Americans want the same thing, but they want those safe zones. So we're going to use those as safe zones. What the Russians have proposed what they're calling deconfliction zones or de-escalation zones. Safe zones, as proposed by the Americans, are nothing more than proxies as staging areas for their proxies in Jabhat al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda and whatnot. That's what our leaders in Washington want. Okay, I don't necessarily know that that's what Donald Trump wants, but that's certainly what the leadership in Washington wants, because they want Assad gone. All right, and by creating zones of where there'll be no Russian planes bombing anybody, there'll be no overt hostilities between those guys and the Syrian army. It gives them the opportunity to congregate pockets of resistance with which to then strike out militarily, and no one's able to strike back. It's no different than really just extending the Turkish border far south into Idlib and Homs. That's what the U.S. wants. Russia wants no part of that. So what the Russians, the Turks, and the Iranians have agreed to is these de-escalation zones that Russia's been proposing since John Kerry was the Secretary of State last summer. And so, in a sense, now we have an agreement where the Turks, after Erdogan met with Putin, and we have the Turks agreeing to the Russians' definition of deconfliction or de-escalation. It's their job now to go back to their proxies, because the same people who the U.S. want, the Turks want the same. The Turks in the U.S. have been the ones backing these groups to try and overthrow Assad. So now the Turks have to go back into Idlib and Homs and get these guys to stand down. And if they don't, well, that's just going to put Erdogan and Putin at even greater odds and the greater loggerheads than they were before. So, Erdogan out of this gets the message plain and clear that the Americans have almost zero influence, despite the strike by Trump at the Al-Sharad Air Base, have absolutely no real influence in the western part of the country at all. And the idea that they're going to be able to overthrow Assad is gone, and he's now cutting the best deal that he can. And for that, the Russians and the Turks agreed to normalize trade and travel and work across the Russian-Turkish border, and they agreed on something like $22 billion worth of investment, a $22 billion nuclear power plant to ensure that the beginnings of the laying the pipe for Turkish Stream pipeline across the Black Sea is going forward. And in fact, Erdogan came home from Moscow with his tail between his legs and some economic benefits that he desperately needs, because the Turkish economy is a mess. And there's an article on Zero Hedge this morning discussing the bifurcation between investors panic buying Turkish bonds and the Turkish misery index, which is just insane at this point. So, and again, I'll probably put a link to that article in the description of this video as well. It's really important that you get some of the background on this stuff as we go along here. So, in the end, I've taken a lot of heat on Twitter from friends of mine who think that who are in vehement disagreement with me about the Al-Sharad airstrikes, and they're wrong. Okay, I got multiple people telling me, hey, look, it's always been about creating safe zones in Syria, blah 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 blah. I'm like, yeah, define those safe zones. Okay, are they the Russian definition of the safe zones or the American definitions of the safe zones? And I can tell you that the attack at Al-Sharad was designed to intimidate the Russians into giving up ground so that the removal of Assad can go forward, and Trump didn't get that. So that phone call between Trump and Putin on Tuesday was Putin informing Trump of what was going to be discussed at Astana, what was going to be agreed upon at Astana, and he can support that or not. And you'll note that while they talked about this and they're in agreement about what was said, that's all they agreed to. Nothing more than that. There was no statement from the Americans in any way, or that they were that they support this process or anything else. Moreover, note also that since that's the case, Putin also pretty much told Trump, if you want any help from me whatsoever, true help from me in dealing with ISIS, which you can have, you need to put people on the Syrian Turkish border to stop the Turks from invading the Kurds in northwestern Syria and northeastern Syria and northern Iraq, which is exactly what's been done. So in the end, exactly what has transpired is what I said would transpire on the evening of April 7th when I went ballistic and said this is all wrong. What Trump just did here is the stupidest thing I've ever seen somebody do geopolitically, which it was. He's now had to walk it back in such a way that he's lost all leverage in Syria. Period. Now he's going to get, what they're going to get is they've lost control of a NATO ally, Turkey. They've lost any attempt at any reasonable position with which to put pressure on Assad to step down. And they're now having to actively fight a NATO member to stop the partitioning of Syria. Now, that doesn't mean that Plan B, which is a balkanization of that area of the world into Greater Kurdistan, is still not on the table for the Americans. Putin has to work on that problem next. But for right now, his focus is ISIS and stabilizing the Assad regime. And in that case, he's won everything. And Trump better watch himself because he's now short-stacked. All right. So that's that. Again, really important stuff. Then the next thing is to talk about the win yesterday over the repeal of Obamacare. And I'm not going to, I didn't go into the guts of the ACHA. I don't know what was actually agreed upon. I'm going to say that there are some things that were probably in this bill that are probably better, but at the end of the day, it's still Obamacare light. It'll improve things, a little bit, but the truth of the matter is that it's not like we're getting the Rand Paul bill. So there's no free market in healthcare, and this is just another example of, after the budget deal that went through the other day, the funding, the stopgap funding bill that was passed to keep the government open until September, is that Trump has no principles. He doesn't. He's a deal maker, and he's an appeaser. That's who he is. I mean, he has some principles. They're in there somewhere, okay? And I firmly believe that where he and Putin have common ground is in their desire to see their desire to defend people's right to religious self-determination, and that I fundamentally believe. And Putin absolutely has been a force for good in that respect, and I think Trump is turning out to be a force for good in that as well. And that's something to praise him for, like the executive order lifting the restrictions on speech for 501c3 organizations, I think is a very good thing. And let's get people out there in the open discussing discussing their positions, regardless of whether or not they have tax exempt status or not. It's crazy. The First Amendment was never meant to be freedom from religion for liberals. It was always meant to be freedom from the government persecuting your religious views. Period. It's a freedom to express your religion and what that means politically. And the idea that we can separate religion and politics completely is simply a Marxist concept, and it belongs in the aspirant of history. So I think that's a very good thing. There's so many little things that Trump is doing right. I want to believe that the man is smarter than he is. What I'm going to tell you right now is this is how I feel about Trump right now, and that is that he came into power with a lot of misconceptions about how the world works and about how to utilize his power. He made a mistake in April attacking Syria, and he's since realized that mistake for what it is. Now, did he do so in some 4D chess thing to expose the neocons and show the error of their ways? No, he didn't. He did what he thought was the right thing at the time. And then he got better information and completely changed course without apologizing for it. That's Donald Trump in a nutshell. He will always do this. Okay? That does not mean that as supporters of the things that he's attempting to do, that we should blindly give him our support because eventually he'll get the right answer. No, when he makes a mistake, we need to be on top of him and tell him it was a mistake so that he has the support to change course properly. Because if he's doing the bidding of the globalists and the neocons, then he has to be reminded that we don't agree with this. This is not what we voted for. All right. So I'm not crazy about the win in Obamacare. I know what it means for him politically right now, but after the disastrous budget deal, to get this passed through, to twerk the Democrats a little bit and to keep them off balance, it's a political win, and we'll take it. And if it marginally improves the situation in healthcare, well, you take the small victories you can get in this life, and you move on. All right. The last thing to talk about is, do we need to sell in May? Well, if we're talking gold and silver and oil, then absolutely. And if we're talking the stock market, not completely. So let's get to the charts, and I'll get you out of here. All right. So let's talk about gold. The FOMC met on Wednesday. They made their statement. That statement was a particularly hawkish statement. And I have an article up on Seeking Alpha right now talking about why gold is getting crushed in this environment right now. And it's about liquidity. It's about dollar liquidity. And it has been since Brexit. There's a very strong correlation between the changes in the excess reserve account with the Federal Reserve of the banks and gold, meaning the banks are using this $2.2 to $2.5 trillion balance as a slush fund to move back and forth to shore up their capital adequacy ratios on a day-to-day basis, their dollar funding needs on a day-to-day basis, either getting it to cash or treasuries or whatever they need to do. And you can see it in the numbers of the non-reserve balances. There's line items in the Fed's balance sheet. The non-reserve balances held with the Federal Reserve banks, excuse me, and the outstanding reverse repos, which is another way of saying the Fed selling their security, their U.S. Treasuries, back to the banks for short-term purposes in order to shore up capital adequacy numbers under Dodd-Frank and all of that stuff. So that's what's going on here. And when there's an extreme dollar liquidity situation, gold gets sold because it's the easiest thing in the world to sell to get to raise cash. Because there's not a fund in this world other than a specific gold fund that has to hold gold or gold futures contracts as a portion of its portfolio. There's only like maybe 5 of those funds in the world, maybe 10. Okay, out of the hundreds of thousands of funds that are out there that have to hold either cash, that have limits on holding cash, that have to hold treasury bonds, and blah 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 blah. So at the end of the day, the thing that traders and fund managers have at their disposal with which to sell to raise cash is gold. It's just an easy sell because at the end of the day, it's just ultimately just a currency pair. And so you can sell the euro just as easily. You can sell gold. You can sell to raise dollars. You can sell gold, and that's why gold gets whacked in times like this. It's also very instructive to understand that there's something bad happening behind the curtains, and it's been going on since Brexit. That Brexit did fundamentally break something, because there's so much central bank largesse sloshing around the banking system. They're able to keep it all under control until that day that they can't. And so for right now, the system looks anti-fragile, but it's absolutely not. It's actually absolutely the most fragile I think that it's ever been. Okay, so as if you're a gold enthusiast like I am, what you're looking for is a rebound today back up to this 1250 level or so, which I don't think is going to happen. If it does, that's great. If we get a spike low here, that'd be awesome. It would be really, really bullish. Okay. Really bullish, but it's not most likely going to happen. Most likely we're going to continue to get this kind of downtrend because we're into the seasonal problems with gold. These things always seem to happen in April and May. I wonder why. If you believe still in the idea that the Fed is manipulating the gold market, they're not manipulating the gold market. They're manipulating everything else, and gold happens to be the thing that gets whacked the hardest. And there's always the happy accident of getting gold to get crushed in either April or May. So it doesn't always happen. They change the timing point on it every year, but at some point gold's going to get whacked for $150 to $200 in this portion of the year, either in the late Q1 or some point in Q2. So I would be betting on right now that we don't get a weekly close above 1250 today, and that more likely we're going to see a retest of 1196. And then if that fails in the coming weeks, we're going to see a retest. We're going to see a move back to the 2015 low at around 1124, 1125. So that's what you're looking at in gold technically, and there's really nothing else to say about it. But of course, every time I do one of these podcasts, I will say something about it just to give you an idea as to whether or not anything has changed technically. All right, and then we're going to look at silver. And this is the situation for silver. It's even worse in silver. We've already broken through that first layer of support that was built in the February pullback. And again, we're going to need to see a move above 1682 today. Not likely. Or we're definitely looking at 1576, which is the December low. And again, that's pretty much all you're looking at there. And the reason why these two things are going to continue probably to sell off is because we now have an honest to God breakdown in oil. This is Brent crude. Yeah, I don't really follow WTI crude because I could care less, because because WTI crude does not set the world benchmark price for oil anymore. Brent really does. Almost, most oil sold around the world is priced in relation to Brent, either Minas crude or Tapis crude or whatever grade of crude, Saudi crude, all of it. It's all priced relative to Brent crude, which is North Sea slope crude oil, not West Texas Intermediate, because we don't export West Texas Intermediate anymore. The Brent is exported around the world, and that's just the way it is. And we're an important consumer of oil, but not nearly as important as we were, say, 20 years ago. All right, so this is in the overnight markets, oil got whacked for about a 3% loss, and that takes this weak downtrend, because we didn't even get a 2-bar reversal, barely got even a 3-bar reversal here. All it did was kind of drift back towards the support line and around $50 a barrel, and then there was the opportunity for it to break higher from here, and this is kind of like a flag pattern, right? So you go one, and a flag, and then up, and then a flag. That's failed. That second flag has failed, and we're going to most likely get a bearish weekly close here, which is going to put us on track to retest 45, 42, and then if that fails, we're definitely looking at a 30 handle. And I fully expect to see $35 a barrel oil, and the Saudis definitely do not want to see $35 a barrel oil. They've been doing everything imaginable, along with the U.S. banks who are stuffed to the gills with bad oil patch revolver debt. They don't want to see $35 a barrel oil either. But the supply and demand fundamentals for oil are awful, and that's just the way it is. And the Russians are happy to have the price of oil drop here, because remember, the ruble free floats in the open market, and the dollar price of the ruble is not really that important to them anymore when their biggest customer, the Chinese, are paying in yuan anyway. So very, very important to understand all of that, that the oil market is fundamentally changing, and I think it's changing in such a way that 5 years from now we're going to talk about the oil markets in ways that we haven't in over a generation, probably 2 generations. All right, so that's pretty much what I have for this Friday morning. Let's see how things close. We want to watch for the numbers I talked about. So going back real quick, we want to look for about 1250 close in gold and 1685 or so on silver. If we don't get either of those levels, then we're going to get further washouts. And the idea that we're going to get some kind of 3 to 5% pop in the price of oil to create a spike low here is laughable, frankly. But in these markets, with the powerful forces that are in play, I can't make predictions anymore. All right. You guys take care. Have a great weekend. I will probably be back Sunday to discuss what's happening with the French elections and see how things closed and how the headlines shake out. So that's what I've got. You guys take care. Have a great weekend and keep your stick on the ice.